Hey, it's Art from My New Microphone. In this video, I want to convince you to stop wasting so much time mixing your tracks in solo and to do this instead. Let's talk about it. Of course, there are instances where processing a track in solo is appropriate, that is removing noise or resonances or shaping the tone of the instrument itself. However, we can often get lost when processing a track in solo trying to make it sound perfect on its own and forgetting that mix is ultimately about balancing all of the elements together into a cohesive piece of music. I'll restate that. Mixing is about achieving a great balance between all of the tracks in the mix, not about making each track sound perfect on its own. So, beyond specific tone shaping and cleanup duties, I would highly encourage you to stop mixing in solo and to start mixing everything in the context of the mix. Let's consider a few common processes in mixing and why setting them in the context of the mix is much better than setting them in solo. Starting with EQ, let's discuss a big problem that we encounter often in mixing, and that is frequency masking. Frequency masking happens when two or more tracks are competing heavily for the same band of frequencies. And what happens is rather than each track being heard as its own separate element, they begin blending together and lose their distinction. Using EQ, we can find the element that most deserves that specific frequency band and give it a slight boost, and then cut that frequency band from the other instruments in the mix to make more room for everything in that specific frequency band and to reduce frequency masking. Common elements that often clash together and cause frequency masking between the tracks are bass and kick drum, vocals, and pretty much any other instrument that happens to have mid-range frequencies, guitars and bass, acoustic guitars and electric guitars, background vocals and pads, and the list goes on. If we were to EQ any of these specific elements in solo, we can make them sound great by themselves, but as soon as we start introducing these other tracks into the mix, these EQ moves that we spent so long on in solo may make the mix fall apart as frequency masking comes in, and the separation of these elements and the mix as a whole suffer as a consequence. With denser mixes, as more and more tracks are included in the song, we should pay special attention to frequency masking in the low mid-range, often around 200 to 400 Hertz, and consider using EQ to cut frequencies in this range from a few instruments if the buildup in this low mids is too much, causing a muddy mix. These low mid-range cuts may not seem necessary in any specific track in solo. However, when they are all combined in the mix, this buildup of frequency content here can lead to a muddy mix, and using EQ can help solve this issue. Speaking of denser mixes, as more and more tracks begin competing for real estate in the frequency spectrum, we may need to go through the individual tracks and EQ them in specific ways that aren't necessarily natural on their own. These aggressive EQ moves may be perfect for fitting that specific track into the mix as a whole. However, if we were to solo that track and listen to it on its own, those EQ moves may sound wildly unnatural and pretty horrible. Another point on using EQ in the context of the mix is for perceived depth. By using a high shelf cut or boost or a low pass filter in some cases, we can make a single track sound brighter or darker in the context of the mix, thereby affecting the perceived depth by bringing the track closer to the listener or pushing it further away from the listener, respectively. Using EQ for depth in this way would be virtually impossible in solo, as we won't have anything to reference the track against. Moving on to compression now, I like to simplify compression when I'm teaching it and think of it as a sort of automatic fader control. As the signal feeding the compressor surpasses a set threshold level, the compressor effectively attenuates the signal, acting as an automatic fader or volume control. When thinking of compression this way, we can tie it in very nicely to the balance of the mix with faders. And as we know, balancing the mix with faders has nothing to do with making any individual track sound great in solo. It's often the case that a track that sounds way overcompressed in solo actually fits perfect in the context of the mix. If we think about parallel compression for a second, we have the original track that is being sent to an effects return, and that effects return is being heavily compressed before being mixed back in with the original signal. While it can be beneficial to solo that parallel compression channel to really hear how much we're compressing the signal, when it comes to bringing that fader up and mixing the compressed signal in with the rest of the mix, doing so in solo doesn't make much sense. When it comes to sidechain compression, that is taking an external sidechain signal to control a compressor that is acting on another signal, we need at least two signals to do this, and the reduction of frequency masking between these two signals, along with any pumping effects that we are going for with the sidechain compression, can really only be honed in the greater context of the mix. If you're finding this video informative thus far, I would invite you to hit that like button and to also check out the description box down below to grab your free copy of the My New Microphone mixing cheat sheet. Now, I realize that there are no cheat codes when it comes to mixing and that every mix is different. However, this cheat sheet reference guide I put together for you walks you through the step-by-step processes of the mix and helps you make the right decisions at the right times for your mixes. So again, I will leave a link down in the description box below for you to check out my free mixing cheat sheet if you are interested. Thanks. Okay, moving on to saturation. It's often the case, like compression, that a track by itself can sound way oversaturated, although it will fit perfectly in the mix with that amount of saturation. On the flip side, when adding saturation and harmonic distortion to a track in solo, we can have the effect of making it sound nice and full in the mid-range, only to have it compete with many other tracks and cause frequency masking when referencing it against the rest of the mix. When it comes to reverb and delay, I would always suggest setting up an effects return and then inserting the time-based effect on the return channel rather than on the specific track itself. That way we have much more control over the level in the mix of the reverb or delay, and we can also insert other processes on the return channel to add even more interest to the reverb or delay. Although we can process this return channel of reverb or delay in solo, much like the example of parallel compression mentioned earlier, when it comes time to actually use this reverb or delay to create a sense of ambience or space or special effect in the mix, there's no way of doing that by simply mixing it in solo. Also, when setting up time-based effects like reverb and delay on specific tracks or buses, it's important to reference them in the greater context of the mix to avoid a situation where we have an uncanny type of reverb or delay that really doesn't fit the entire vibe of the mix. It can easily be the case that a reverb setting or a delay setting sound great on an individual track or bus, yet in the greater context of the mix sounds greatly out of place. So I hope that I've convinced you to stop using so much time processing tracks in solo if you've been doing so. Again, mixing is all about the balance of all of the tracks working together, and mixing in context is an invaluable habit to develop as we develop our overall mixing skills. So I encourage you in the majority of cases to mix in context of the mix and hit that like button of this video if you found it valuable. Also check out the free mixing cheat sheet in the description box down below, and I will put up another few videos on this end screen worth checking out having to do with mixing. So click on one of these up here and I'll see you in the next one.